Get started. All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our special event training about procurement today. I'm so glad that you could join us. I'm Marie Stephenson from the State Charter School Board staff. I'm over authorization and school support. So that second part, school support, is what brings you here today. So thank you so much for joining us. Today we have Adam Hurd and Michael Iwasaki from the Utah State Board of Education who will be providing this training for us. So we will go ahead and turn the time over to them. I have the chat enabled, so if you need to ask a question or something, you are welcome to put that in chat, or if you'd like to unmute and ask a question, that would probably be okay as well. Adam and Michael can confirm on that, but we will go ahead and turn the time over to them.
Right, great. Thank you, Marie. And yes, absolutely. If you have questions at any time, feel free to unmute and jump in. Sometimes that's just easier than putting it in the chat or waiting till the end. So yes, by all means do that if you have questions. And let me go ahead and share my screen. I've just got a PowerPoint that we will start off with. Okay, fantastic. Marie or Michael, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay, great. So yeah, thanks again, Marie. So yeah, like she said, I'm Adam Hurd, and with me is Michael Iwasaki, and we're both purchasing managers here at USBE. So first of all, thank you for joining us today. I realize everybody has very busy schedules and a lot of stuff going on right now, I'm sure with COVID as well. So we appreciate you taking the time to come and learn about the wonderful world of procurement. So yeah, we'll just be going over kind of a procurement 101, just kind of like a broad overview of public procurement. So hopefully there are some things in here that you find useful in your jobs, and yeah. So yeah, getting started. So what's the point of public procurement? This always seems like a good place to start. And the Procurement Code actually tells us exactly what that is. So in section 63G 6A 102, it states that the underlying purposes and policies of this chapter are to ensure transparency in the public procurement process, to ensure the fair and equitable treatment of all persons who participate in the public procurement process, to provide increased economy in state procurement activities, and to foster effective broad-based communication or competition within the free enterprise system. So you can see what it really boils down to is just creating a transparent, fair, and competitive process for all those involved in the procurement processes. And this includes government employees, vendors, taxpayers, kind of everybody. And as stewards of taxpayer dollars, we have a responsibility to spend those funds appropriately, and making the entire process, from the solicitation all the way through fulfillment of the contract, just making that as open and transparent as possible. And by doing so, it better serves the interests of your entity, your charter school, the taxpayers, vendor competition, and preventing fraud or misuse of funds in public procurement. It seems like there's kind of this general consensus that most government employees don't like working with the procurement people. A lot of times they just see us as like a roadblock, or that we just complicate the process and, make purchases take so much longer. And, although, some of that may be true to a certain extent. Yes, it would be quicker if people could just go and pick whatever, pick whatever vendor they wanted to work with and just go and enter into a contract on their own rather than going through a competitive process. But, if it were done that way, it almost certainly wouldn't provide for an open, transparent, and fair process. And, within our team here, the purchasing team at USBE, we often say that our job is to keep USBE out of the news. The last thing we want is for one of the news stations to do a story, about USBE, accusing us of misusing public funds because, one of our contracts wasn't done correctly, or, we didn't follow the law when selecting a vendor. So we really do take our job seriously because we recognize that we have this responsibility to spend the money that we've been entrusted with appropriately. So procurement code and rules. So how do the Procurement Code and administrative rules apply to charter schools? So charter schools are considered educational procurement units under the Procurement Code. And what this means is that they are independent procurement units that handle all of their own procurements, and they're not required to go through state purchasing as a lot of other state agencies do. However, anytime public funds are expended or used to acquire a procurement item, which includes a good, a service, or construction, compliance with the Utah Procurement Code and applicable administrative rules is required. So although charter schools are independent procurement units, just like USBE is, they're still required to follow code and rule. And some of you may know that USBE has created some of its own administrative rules regarding procurement, and those can be found in R277-122. However, at this time, charter schools are not subject to USBE's procurement administrative rules. But to kind of just clarify that, at the state level, meaning like the state charter school board and its employees and its staff, like Marie, they are bound, by the same rules, the R277-122 that the board has established, but the individual charter schools themselves are not. So rather, the Procurement Code states that the Procurement Policy Board is the applicable rulemaking authority for all public schools and charter schools. And the Procurement Policy Board has created the rules in R33. So at this time, those are the rules that charter schools are subject to. However, in addition to that, charter schools as LEAs, you can create your own rules or policies that don't conflict with R33, but any such rules or policies must be stricter, not more lenient than R33. So for example, like the small purchase threshold, most people are familiar with that. Which is currently set at $5,000. A charter school could make its own rule or policy that would reduce that threshold to $1,000, meaning that any purchase over $1,000 would require some sort of competitive process. But it couldn't, create a policy or a rule that would increase that small purchase threshold to $10,000 because that would clearly exceed the $5,000 threshold in R33. So now there are standard and non-standard procurement processes. Some of the more common or regularly used standard procurement processes include quotes, invitations for bids, requests for statement of qualifications, and requests for proposals. Non-standard procurement processes, on the other hand, or exceptions, which include ACWESPP, which stands for Award of a Contract Without Engaging in a Standard Procurement Process, or what most people just refer to as sole source. And an ACWESPP can be awarded based on three different things: a sole source, like a true sole source, transition costs, or that the procurement, that it's impractical or not in the best interest of the procurement unit to go out for some other type of standard competitive process. So first, looking at the standard procurement processes, here are the thresholds that are identified for each of them in the Procurement Code. So beginning with small purchases have two thresholds. There's the individual item, individual procurement item threshold and single procurement aggregate threshold. So the difference between those is the individual procurement item threshold means that each item is $5,000 or less. So that could be a book or a piece of software, something like that, where it's just, a single item. Whereas the single procurement item threshold means that the total dollar amount for a single purchase or transaction, with all individual items in the procurement being under the $5,000, must not exceed $10,000. So in other words, buying many items under $5,000, or actually I guess it would be maximum of two, or up to two at one time, but not spending more than $10,000 total in that single purchase. Now, when every item being purchased is less than the $5,000 and the total shopping cart is less than the $10,000, then you do not have to go out and get quotes. You can simply purchase from the best source, even if it's the only source. So pretty straightforward with those. There is an annual cumulative threshold. This is something to be mindful of and can easily be overlooked. So when making small purchases within these thresholds without obtaining quotes, there is an annual cumulative threshold of $50,000 per vendor. So what that means is that if you have, 10 $5,000 purchases from that same vendor in a given fiscal year, that's okay because the total is within that $50,000 threshold. But if that annual total exceeds $50,000, then you would no longer be in compliance with the Procurement Code. One relatively simple solution for this is just simply to get quotes. If you get a minimum of 2 quotes, then the purchase would fall within the quotes process, not the small purchase. And then therefore it's not included in that annual cumulative threshold. So something kind of easy to work around that. So speaking of quotes, I mean, that's the next process we have on here. And that's for purchases up to $50,000. If it's above $50,000, then that would require some other type of standard procurement process or an exception. And with those, you need to receive a minimum of 2 quotes, and then you select the vendor with the lowest cost. After that, we have professional service providers and consultants. The threshold for this is $100,000, and you would need to receive a minimum of 3 quotes or responses before selecting a vendor. And I put in there quotes or responses just because there can kind of be 2 different processes you could use to go about this. If you need a professional service provider and of certain vendors in the community that can offer these services, you can contact them directly, with your scope of work and ask them to provide you a quote to meet that scope of work. Or if you don't know any vendors in that community, or you just want to see, if there are other vendors out there that you're not aware of, you have the option to do a professional services solicitation, where you would, post that on like an e-procurement system and put it out there with the scope of work and let the vendors submit responses in response to that solicitation. So, I mean, similar process, just kind of a little bit different way about going about that. But in either case, you would need to receive a minimum of 3 quotes or responses and evaluate those before selecting the vendor based on a best value determination. After that, we have the small purchase design professional, which really is similar to the professional service providers. You have the same $100,000 threshold, minimum of 3 quotes or responses before selecting for an award. After that, we have the small purchase of construction. That one has a threshold of $25,000 for a direct award. So if your construction project is under $25,000, you can make a direct award by working directly with one vendor rather than going out for quotes. I mean, of course, you can go out for quotes if you would like to keep it competitive, but if it's under $25,000, you can make that direct award. For larger projects up to $100,000, you do have to get a minimum of 2 quotes. For construction projects with an AVL or an approved vendor list, this one with an approved vendor list, that means that some sort of solicitation has already been posted and the vendors have responded and their responses have been evaluated and they've been approved to be on this vendor list. So they've kind of been vetted more or less at that point. And so at that point, you can award or work with a vendor to award a contract for up to the $2.5 million threshold. You would just want to, there are some requirements when using the approved vendor lists as far as like rotating through the different vendors that are on the list or how you ensure that, vendors are getting a chance at getting those contracts equally rather than just selecting the same vendor each time you need a certain type of project. So be sure to, look at any of those that might be included in the contract or in code and rule itself to make sure that you're complying with any of those requirements to still make it fair to all the vendors that are on that approved vendor list. And then last, we have the request for proposals, and that would be required for anything over $100,000. Of course, you could do a request for proposals for something under $100,000, It's just simply required if it's going to be over that $100,000 threshold.
Really quickly, Adam, we have
Yeah.
a question. If you could go through the small purchase, individual and single item thresholds again.
Oh, sure. Let's see. I skipped over. Okay. Yeah. So, was there a specific question, Michael? Sorry, I can't see the chat right now.
No, it's just to kind of go through it again and repeat it.
Okay. Yeah, and also I'll say we can make this PowerPoint. We can give it to Marie, and she can make it available to you all as well. So you can have all of these later to refer back to if that helps. But yeah, so for the individual procurement item, that's going to be a $5,000 threshold, and so that individual procurement item is just one single item. If you're, I mean, it would be an expensive book, but if there was a book for up to $5,000, or a piece of software that's just one individual item, that's where that $5,000 threshold comes into play. Whereas the single procurement item, that's when you're buying multiple things in one purchase. So say you have a project, and so you needed to buy some books as well as some software for something. As long as each of the individual items, say the books and then the software, like the books were under $5,000, the software was under $5,000, the total cost from that one vendor, basically everything in your cart, quote unquote, is less than the $10,000, then you're still within that single procurement item threshold. Hope that answers the question. If not, please let me know and we can work through that some more. So yes, so moving on back to the RFPs. So what makes a good RFP? There are several things.
Adam?
Yeah.
I do think that there's more questions in the chat. Would you like me to read them for you?
Yeah, let's hear them.
So someone asked, does a statement of qualification meet the RFP requirement, or do you have to do the RFP? And then the next is for construction or design services over 100,000. Okay.
So sorry, will you repeat that first question about the RFP?
So I think it's all together, if I'm reading it correctly. Does a statement of qualification meet the RFP requirement, or do you have to do the RFP?
That's a good question. Let's see, let's go back here. If it's over $100,000, is that what it said?
Then the next statement from that person, and she could maybe speak up and clarify what she's asking, because then it says for construction or design services over 100,000. Jennifer Martin, could you maybe clarify your question?
Yes, I'm sorry. I am asking for any construction projects or design services that would be over $100,000. Can you do a statement of qualifications, or do you need to do an actual request for proposal?
Yeah, if you're getting over that $100,000, then it would need to be the request for proposals. Yeah. If you're under that $100,000 threshold, then yeah, you do have those other options. But if it's going to be over, then yeah, you have to go the full-blown RFP. Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
Thank you. And then one more question is also the procurement thresholds are in R33, not R277, correct?
Correct. So I think there may be some included in the Procurement Code in 63G6A, but I think R33 has some additional ones as well. So you'll want to check both of those. Yeah, the ones that are in R277-122, those are specific to the board because we have established some other thresholds. For example, the small purchase threshold, we did establish a different one for us. But again, those wouldn't apply to charter schools.
Thank you, Adam. That's all that is in the comments for right now.
All right, fantastic. So yeah, so what makes a good RFP? So there are several things that are going to have an impact on your RFP. And the first is the scope of work and the specifications. During the solicitation, the scope of work is really what tells the vendors what you're looking for and what they will be doing, if selected for the contract, of course, so they can respond accordingly. Now, when preparing for your RFP and drafting the scope of work, asking the following questions can help ensure that you're including all of the necessary information. So like who, what, where, when, and why. Who will be doing what? What are the duties and responsibilities of the vendor? And what are the charter school's duties and responsibilities? Where will the goods or services be provided? When? What's the time frame that the goods or service need to be provided? Are there certain milestones or deadlines that need to be included? And why are you even doing the RFP? What's the problem that you're trying to solve or the need that you're trying to satisfy? What do you need and what do you want to solve this problem? Kind of approaching your scope of work with these questions in mind is a good way of guiding you in, drafting a good comprehensive scope of work that really will most effectively communicate that information to the vendor community and help them know how to respond to the RFP, to really build or draft a solid response, showing how they can meet these requirements that you need. In addition to that, we have the MMRs, or the mandatory minimum requirements, and the technical criteria. Those are also things that are really important to consider when you're drafting your RFP. For the MMRs, these are the objective criteria that the vendors must meet, the things that are an absolute must that the vendors have to possess or provide to even be considered for the contract. And this could be things like certain qualifications, or a certain amount of experience in the industry, or education or certifications. It could also be a deadline. If you need a solution in place by a specific deadline, that's something that you can include. And I've done this before, where I include that as a mandatory minimum requirement that the vendors must commit to meeting this deadline, or they just simply can't be considered. Like it's a hard stop if they can't meet that. For technical criteria, these are the subjective criteria that the vendor's proposals will be evaluated against. These are going to relate to the scope of work and the specifications, and how well the proposal addresses those items. So it's important to have both the MMRs and the technical criteria identified and included with the RFP. Not only because the evaluation committee will be limited to these items when they're reviewing and actually scoring their proposals, but also to be fully open and transparent with the vendors that, these are the items that their proposals will be evaluated against. So that it's, very clear up front that the vendors know what the expectation is. This is what we're looking for. This is, what you need to include in your response. And yeah. Then next, there's the evaluation committee. It's good to have an idea of who will be serving on your evaluation committee, in the early stages of drafting your RFP. The committee will usually be comprised of like the subject matter experts, the people who know about the problem or the need that the contract is intended to solve. So they also can often be useful to assist with drafting the scope of work, the MMRs, and the technical criteria, just to ensure that all the pertinent information is being included and accurately communicated to the vendors. So yeah, having an idea of that evaluation committee up front can be useful. That way also when they're actually reviewing and scoring the proposals, they know what they had in mind when they were originally drafting the RFP. So, they have a better understanding of what they're looking for and how those should be scored accordingly. So, in the end, taking all of these things into account when you're drafting and conducting your RFP, not only will it increase your chances of a successful RFP and a successful contract, but it'll reduce your chances of a protest. If you're conducting an open and fair RFP and the vendors don't feel like you are doing anything improper, like trying to hide the ball or steering the RFP towards a specific vendor, they're going to be less likely to file a protest. But, even if you do get a protest, because sometimes it seems like no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try to do everything correctly, vendors sometimes still file protests. which is completely within their right. I mean, that's why it's permitted in the code. But you're going to be more likely to be able to dismiss it because you did everything properly and according to code and rule. So yeah, hopefully these provide some, general guidelines that help you in that process of building an RFP, because it is it can be a fairly complicated process and a lot of work goes into it. So if you kind of keep these things in mind when you're building that, hopefully that will make things more successful for you and prevent any protests or any complications down the road, or not even a protest, but when it comes to actually having the vendor fulfill the contract, so that everything was kind of covered up front. So both you and the vendor are on the same page and you kind of know what's expected of each of you. Michael, do you have anything to add to that? Did I overlook anything?
I don't think so. So I noticed there's this solicitation questionnaire on the slide, and I can share what that looks like. If you
Yes, definitely. Let me stop sharing, and yeah, you can bring that up.
Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So this will actually help walk you through if you do find you need to do an RFP. This will be a really good resource for you to start with, because it really does just walk you through all the steps for putting together an RFP. And this is also going to be very helpful for whoever is going to be, whoever the purchasing agent that is going to be releasing this RFP. It'll be very helpful for them to refer to this as they put that together. So just running through it, it's got the contact information. This section 2 is the procurement item. This is where you kind of are going to explain what you need exactly. And then contract information. So you probably won't know a lot of this, but it will be helpful to provide any current or expiring contracts that you might be needing this procurement item to take the place of. And then a target contract start date. So, if you need to have a contract in place by, say March, then you would put that in there, and that would kind of give the purchasing agent a way to formulate the timeline for the RFP process. Contract term, general term is 5 years, but it could be more or less. You'll just have to provide a justification if you want to do it more than 5 years. Same thing with renewal options. If you wish to have renewal options built into the contract, you could potentially do that as long as you provide a justification for that. If you're going to be awarding to a single offer or multiple offers, you'd want to note that as well. Are you going to allow any price increases during the contract term? The standard terms and conditions, for us, we usually just post our standard terms and conditions. And I'm not sure if your individual LEAs would have their own terms and conditions that they'd want to post. So you note that. And also if you're involving information technology, you might potentially have some information technologies terms and conditions that are separate from your standard terms and conditions. Let's see, insurance. And then this is kind of where we get into the solicitation. So this is where you're going to put in your scope of work. So this is where, as Adam was talking about that scope of work, this is where you're going to provide all those details that you would like to see included in the solicitation. Kind of going through what the vendor is expected to do, what the agency agrees to do, instructions to the vendor, and what specifications are going to form the basis of the contract. You'd also put in like any invoicing instructions, anything like that would be helpful. And then this goes to the criteria that Adam mentioned about the mandatory minimums and the technical criteria. So this is where you would list those out, and if it's a mandatory minimum, you would mark the mandatory requirement. If it's a scoreable technical criteria, then you would mark that, and you would also kind of put on a scale of 1 to 10 of how important you want that, or you feel that that individual criterion is. That's going to help when we do the evaluation with the criteria weight. So, one criterion might be, like, say it's like, trying to think of a good example. Say it's something like just an executive summary where you just want a 1-page executive summary of the procurement item. You might weight that a little lower than something like the overall project management plan, for instance. So it's just kind of a good way to keep in mind of how, of what criterion you want to look at, and also the weight you want to provide to those individual criterions. Cost is also something that we would always look at in an RFP. So this is where you could provide a breakdown of what you want the vendors to provide pricing for, and the importance of that. And these are optional items that you could include in an RFP. So you could have presentations if you feel like that's, if you feel like that will be beneficial. You could ask for customer references. You could request a mandatory site visit or a pre-bid conference, or anything else. There is just a lot of flexibility with RFPs and how you build them. And so I think that's, I know that they can be tedious, but I think that's kind of the nice thing about them in the other sense, is that you really do have a lot of flexibility to build these out how you want them, and to get an item or a service that really meets your needs. And the rest of this is not too important. You kind of want to provide your estimated budget, and then how long you want to post the solicitation, provide the contact information for any vendors that you would like to invite to the solicitation, and then just any other information that you feel is relevant. Adam, did you have anything else from the solicitation questionnaire to point out?
Well, I was just going to say, because it did make me think of a couple things as far as like the evaluation score sheet, where you actually have established the technical criteria and how each are going to be weighted and scored, as well as the cost proposal forms. Those are documents that should also be included with your RFP. Is just kind of a standard, so that the vendors can see clearly, okay, here is the evaluation score sheet, this is how much each item is weighted, and then with the cost proposal forms as well. We'll usually include a cost proposal form, just like an Excel spreadsheet that identifies the different items that we're asking them to provide cost for, rather than them just providing their own, cost breakdown, just so that we can clearly evaluate one vendor against another, based on these different cost items. So yeah, those are a couple of things that should kind of be a standard with your RFPs, as far as documents that you include, along with like your scope of work and terms and conditions and that kind of thing.
Thank you for that, Adam. Also, just one other thing that I thought about too was that for the evaluation committee, per code, we need a minimum of 3 people on that evaluation committee, and so that's just something also to keep in mind. And they need to be available to participate in the entire process. So I've had RFPs where there have been times when a person has had to drop off because they just weren't able to meet at a certain time, or they had other commitments that ended up taking more of their time. So I think it's always kind of just best practice to at least try and get 4 to 5 people on your evaluation committee, just in case someone has to drop off in the middle of it. Okay, I think that's it as far as the solicitation questionnaire goes. And we can also provide this to you along with the PowerPoint at the end.
Yeah, great. All right, thank you, Michael. All right, we'll get back to the PowerPoint. Okay, Yeah, so moving on from RFPs. So the non-standard procurement processes. So non-standard procurement processes, as I mentioned before, an ACWESPP can be awarded, based on sole source, transition costs, or that it's impractical or not in the best interest of the procurement unit. So first, sole sources. Sole sources should be limited to those procurements that really are truly sole sources, meaning there's only one vendor that provides the good or service. At USBE, we kind of deal with this a lot, where you get a requisition where the requester is asking for something to be awarded based on a sole source. For example, is like proprietary systems. This is one that we see a lot, where they've before they do the requisition, they go out and do some research, and they look at what products or what vendors are out there, and then they'll send those to us with their requisition. And I had one specifically, for example, recently that had to do with this proprietary system issue that we sometimes see, where the requisition was for professional services for like math coaches for throughout the LEAs. And the requisition identified a vendor that this requester wanted to use. And she put it in there that she wanted to award it as a sole source, because this vendor had a proprietary system. They were the only, they hadn't licensed it out to any other vendors. They were the only ones with the rights to use and teach this system. So it had to be a sole source, because this is the only vendor that can provide this system, and we need it for this coaching. I had to explain to her that, okay, I mean, that may be true. They may be the only one that can provide this specific system, but they're not the only vendor that can provide professional development for math coaches. There are countless vendors out there that provide professional development as their specialty. So you kind of have to be careful with getting too far into that, okay, this is the only vendor that can provide this thing, but rather kind of take a step back and look at the problem that needs to be solved instead of the specific item that you want, if that makes sense. And yeah, I think that kind of covers it with sole sources. Next, we have transition costs, which I'm actually really not going to go into too deeply, because these can get pretty complicated. And I don't think we really have the time to do a deep dive into them. But the Procurement Code and the administrative rules are very specific about the things that can be considered when doing the analysis of transition costs. So I would just say, if you're ever considering awarding an ACWESPP for this reason, I would just go to Code and Rule and review what's identified in there of the different things that you need to include in that analysis. And then the last one is that it's impractical or not in the best interest of the procurement unit. And R33 identifies that there are 4 circumstances in which a determination can be made that awarding a contract through a standard procurement process is impractical or not in the best interest of the procurement unit. So those are first, that a contract or award to a specific contractor is a condition of a donation or a grant. And this is something that we use fairly regularly at the board, just with the various grants we receive, or if there's a piece of legislation where they've specifically called out a specific contractor that those funds should be going to. Number 2, we have public utility services, when only one utility service is available in the area. 3, an item where compatibility is the overriding consideration. For example, I think one area where you might see this is like with IT solutions, whether it's a software or a hardware solution. If you already have this IT system in place and you need a specific piece of hardware or a specific piece of software that, this is the only thing that's compatible with our existing system, then I think that would be a justifiable reason to award the ACWESPP for that. And last is that a used procurement item that presents a unique, specialized, or time-limited buying opportunity. Personally, I've never actually used that one, but it's there if you ever need to use it. So yeah, so it's pretty straightforward with those. The good or service just essentially has to fall into one of those 4 areas. So purchase splitting. The Procurement Code very clearly prohibits purchase splitting. And the Procurement Code states that it's unlawful for a person knowingly to divide a single procurement into multiple smaller procurements, including by dividing an invoice or purchase order into multiple invoices or purchase orders. If the single procurement would not have qualified as a small purchase, one or more of the multiple smaller procurements qualifies as a small purchase, and the division of the procurement is done with the intent to avoid having to use a standard procurement process that you would otherwise be required to use, or make one or more of the multiple smaller procurements fall below a small purchase threshold that it wouldn't have, had it not been for the division. So this is something that's pretty serious. I mean, splitting purchases is illegal. And when I say illegal, I mean, depending on the dollar amount of the purchase, it could be a misdemeanor or even a felony. So, I mean, the last thing you want, is to end up on the news or in jail for splitting purchases. So my recommendation is just don't do it. And actually, by way of example, I mean, going back to the purchase I talked about just a minute ago about the one I received where she wanted to award it as a sole source. We kind of went back and forth with that. After I explained to her that, it didn't really qualify as a sole source, that, we're going to have to go out and see what other professional service providers are out there and that offer this type of service that she's looking for. And I'm not sure I mentioned, so this procurement was it was going to be a 2-year contract for about $200,000. So, I mean, after I explained to her that, this didn't qualify as a sole source, we're going to have to go out for an RFP for this. She came back to me one more time and asked me, well, we're really on a tight deadline for this. I have to get this, these coaching sessions going as soon as possible. So we really don't have time to go out and do an RFP. How about we split this up and we'll do a 1-year contract for $100,000. And then next year we can do another contract for the final year for $100,000. And I had to explain to her that, no, I mean, that's very clearly that would be splitting the purchase. And, I'm sorry, I'll do whatever I can to help you, but I'm not willing to risk my job or go to jail because I've broken the law, so that you can have your professional development start a few weeks earlier. So, and this was from somebody who actually has been at the board for many, many years and clearly knows the process. So, I mean, even people that know, when certain things aren't permitted, they may still try to get you to do that, for one reason or another. So sometimes you do have to just hold your ground. And even though it may be inconvenient or they may not be happy with it, there are certain things in the code that you just have to follow. And there's just kind of a hard line that you don't cross. So that's one of those situations. But yeah, with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Michael from here, and he can talk about state cooperative contracts.
Thanks, Adam. So actually, state cooperative contracts are really, I think, everybody's best friend. If you're able to find what you're looking for on state contract, then that's probably the best route you can go. Because especially with state contracts, the solicitation has already been conducted, so you don't need to do an additional solicitation. You can just purchase directly from these contracts because they've already been deemed compliant with Procurement Code. They've been vetted. Really, just I would say, if you can find them on that state contract, go for it. There's the link to get to the state cooperative contracts, and then it's just an easy search on that website. And you can also use, I believe that they've also built in a get a quote function on there, so you can also get quotes directly from that website. So if you just click on the get a quote link, it'll pull up a separate page where you just put in the information that you're looking for, and you can and it's going to send an email blast to all the vendors that are on state contract for that particular item or service. Next slide. So here's the fun part, the ethics portion. So part 24 of the Utah Procurement Code addresses ethics. It applies to procurement professionals or staff and not to superintendents, business administrators, principals, but it's still something that you should look at and follow. It prohibits accepting gifts, gratuities, kickbacks, and it indicates that violations may be subject to felony charges, loss of employment, or other penalties. I would just recommend going through that section of the code and just kind of familiarizing yourself with what's in there. But then administrative rules, R33-24 speaks to particular conflicts that might arise. Socialization with vendors. You should probably limit those socialization activities with vendors, especially if they're vendors that you tend to purchase from frequently. So like if you're going through an RFP process, for instance, and you know that this vendor has submitted a proposal and you're on that evaluation committee, you should not be interacting with them during that process. And because it's easy to just start talking about something that's unrelated, but then they could easily the conversation could easily drift into, hey, so I've actually submitted a proposal to this, like, can you tell me what's going on with it? And that's where it starts to cross that line. Financial conflicts are obviously a big deal. If you or a family member have any financial interests in a company that's submitting proposals and that you're evaluating or awarding, that's a problem. And so you would want to divest yourself from that. Personal relationships with vendors, you want to limit those, or if you feel like you have a personal relationship with a vendor that would reflect on your or just be, it would just appear improper, or it would maybe show that you're exhibiting a bias in favor of them, and you would probably want to remove yourself from that situation and not be involved in that solicitation process with that particular vendor. And this is just the ethical standard that we try and abide by. An employee of a procurement unit shall uphold and promote the independence, integrity, and impartiality of the procurement process as required in code and rule, and shall avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety. And even though that applies just to an employee of a procurement unit, I think it's just good practice in general to kind of adhere to avoiding that appearance of impropriety. Next slide. Here's some resources that are available to help you as you're going through the solicitation or procurement process. We've got the USB Purchasing and Contracts page. That's got a lot of helpful resources. It's got that solicitation questionnaire that we went through. It's got other training guides that we've drafted. I think it's just a good place to start. There's also the State of Utah Division of Purchasing. That's where the state cooperative contract search is located. But you can also go to them for courtesy postings where they can post a solicitation for you in their U3P portal, e-procurement portal. You can also review any contracted services or cooperative contracts they have. And there's the website for them. There's also some professional organizations for purchasing. There's the Utah chapter of NIGP, which is the National Institute of Governmental Procurement, I believe is what it stands for. And they are involved in professional development. They also provide resources. It's a national network. So it's a good place to go just to get some general and national perspectives on purchasing. And there's also the EdPAC, which provides training, conferences, and they also have their own cooperative contracts and other resources that might be helpful for you. And actually, I didn't realize that they had their own cooperative contracts until just probably a few months ago. So it is a nice place to go to and just kind of check and see what they have available to purchase from. Next slide. Okay. And there's also these professional development opportunities. So the state purchasing, they have their Procurement Education Partnership or PEP quarterly trainings. There's also the NIGP quarterly meetings, and then an annual forum that's held each year, I believe in August. And then there's also some mentoring opportunities if you go to that Utah NIGP website. There's also the EdPAC Annual Buyers Conference. That's in November, so we just missed it, but that's something to be aware of. And then our state and USB has our purchasing staff meetings on Wednesdays at 9 a.m. And then state purchasing also has their staff meetings at the same time, and those are open to the public. So if you're interested in joining like our staff meeting, please let me or Adam know, and we can arrange that. And lately with everything being virtual, it's a lot easier to jump in on those staff meetings if you're interested. Next slide. So here's just some overall advice. We recommend that you participate in these professional organizations if you get a chance. Once again, they have some really good resources, and since especially like with like EdPAC or the Utah chapter of NIGP, it's statewide, so they are they're not just familiar with, or there's not just resources for like Salt Lake or Davis County, or it's statewide. So I think it's helpful to get involved with those professional organizations. I think it's just also helpful to develop a forms-based practice where you utilize these forms, such as like the solicitation questionnaire or the ACWESPP. It's just helpful to use those forms whenever you're going to try and go out and solicit something, because those forms usually should have been vetted and should be compliant with code and rule. Make sure you're using checklists or standardized practices. I think that's just good practice for any operation, not just purchasing. Make sure you check that your internal policies and practices are compliant with code and rule. I think that's kind of a no-brainer, but it also is just something that bears repeating. Again, use those state contracts if you can find what you're looking for on those state contracts. That's going to make your life a lot more easier. And just use all the resources that are available. Once again, we'll be providing this PowerPoint, so you have those links to all those different organizations and resources. Okay, next slide. And that's pretty much it for us. If you have any questions, that's our contact information. And I think we have a few minutes too, if you have any questions for us. But otherwise, that's it for us.
Thank you, Adam and Michael. We'll stay on and take any questions that anyone wants to ask. So far in the chat, I'm just seeing lots of thank you comments, so that's great. But we'll stay on for a few minutes. Otherwise, have a great afternoon and a good weekend. We really appreciate you being here. We will send out the link to this once it's uploaded onto our YouTube channel as well. So if you want to go back and replay it, or share it with other board members or members of your school team, we're happy to have you share as well.
Yeah, thanks again, Maria. And again, to everybody who joined us today. Yeah, seriously, if we're happy to help whenever we can. We like doing these trainings and help people, because the procurement process can get complicated and there can be a lot of questions. So we're happy to be a resource whenever we can. So if you do have questions, if you want to join our staff meeting, if you just need to know a little bit more about a certain process that you haven't done very often, reach out to us anytime. We're happy to be a resource and provide any knowledge that we have that may be helpful to you. So
Perfect. One question did come in about if we're emailing the slides as well as the link to the video. I'll definitely give that link to the video there. And then as soon as Adam or Michael shares the presentation with me, I can get that shared with you as well. So the
Yeah, as soon
plan
as
will
we're
be
done.
to share both. Yep, perfect. Sorry, Adam, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yes, as soon as we're done, I will send you the slides as well as that solicitation questionnaire. So if anybody wants a copy of that to use as well, feel free to have it.
Fantastic. All right, well, I don't see any other questions. So I'm going to go ahead and end our meeting, but thank you again for being here and have a great rest of your Friday afternoon.